Welcome to the Educate a Girl podcast series. Educate a Girl has set the goal of providing 1,000 young women from 5 continents with scholarships in journalism and media training to strengthen women's voices in media and improve professional gender representation in the field. This series acts as an educational platform for students, professionals, and the recreational listener. Each podcast explores a topic in media and journalism featuring a special guest. Our speaker today is Moira Farr, a freelance writer, magazine editor, and professor at Carleton University. Farr began her journalism career after graduating from the University of Toronto and Ryerson University. She started out as an editor for Canadian Architect magazine and has since worked as an editor and freelancer for many other publications. Farr has been teaching at Carleton University for almost 15 years. She also teaches at Algonquin College in the professional writing program. We began by discussing some of the differences between hard news and magazine writing.
With long form or narrative nonfiction, whatever you might want to call it, the structure is very different. I think the intention is different because with hard news, you are telling a reader what's going on in very factual terms. But a magazine story is meant to dig deeper and give people a bit of larger context for those facts. So you really are telling a story in more of a traditional narrative way, and you're borrowing on the techniques that you would find in a fictional story.
What are some ways writers can find their unique style? Can magazine writing be more personal, and how so?
I think the best way to find your style, which sounds ironic, but is to read a lot and see what other people's style is and then try to write like them. I'm talking right at the beginning of your career when you're just playing around. I found as a young writer that there were certain writers' voices that I really liked, and I probably unconsciously absorbed them and tried to write in those voices. I think it's a little bit like if you're learning piano. You might start imitating somebody you admire, or singing, when you watch one of those singing competition programs, they will often say to the artist that's performing in front of them, you don't need to try and be Mariah Carey or somebody, be yourself. So I just think it's a combination of a lot of reading and a lot of experimentation.
And in terms of personal style, is it okay to kind of put yourself into your writing?
Absolutely. In this form of writing, you will find that that works very well. And the purpose, again, it is not to impose yourself onto the story. And there are ways of introducing yourself as either the reporter. So if you're actually interviewing somebody, you may say, we sat down in this particular room and this person said this to me. Or you might be writing an actual, more of a memoir style story that requires you to delve into your personal experience, but always with the purpose of illuminating something for the readers that they can relate to. It's not just about how great you are or how wonderful your experience or how interesting, but how relatable it is to other people.
And what do you think is the most important lesson for journalists entering the field of magazine writing? And what are some tips and tricks they can remember?
I think the question is both thinking through what it is you're trying to talk about on a thematic level. So what is your overall purpose or point to the story, and what is the focus of the story? So you need a focus that's clear, you need a theme, and then you need a structure for taking the reader through the story. And it's a very different structure from a news story. So you need to start thinking about writing in scenes, describing people, describing places. And if you're going to have some factual material in there, you kind of alternate between scenes and fact. And you need to really work on your opening because you're trying to grab the reader in the same way as a fictional author might be doing. And you also need to end your story with, well, some people call it a kicker, because you want to leave that reader with, sort of an emotional impact or a memorable scenario that relates to the larger theme of your story.
And with hard news, we often talk about the inverted pyramid, right? Talking about the hard news first and then kind of trickling down. Yes. How is the structure very different from that?
Well, that whole structure, of course, comes from a very old model, which was that you might get your story cut by an ad that came in late in a print newspaper. So we really don't have that same situation now, mostly if you're talking about internet writing and certainly magazine writing. So you want that story to hang together just as well as a short story of fiction might hang together, or a novel, from beginning to end.
And what are some of the most common mistakes journalists make when writing for magazines?
Well, I find that if you're a trained journalist, you may be afraid to bring this I person into the story. So sometimes people get stuck kind of between styles, so that's never good. If you start with a personable voice, then you can't suddenly step into objective reporter mode. If it's your story, then you tell it in your voice. I think another thing, of course, would be the structure. I'm actually marking some stories now in my magazine writing class, and that is something I'm saying to people is, you need a theme statement, or you need to alternate these scenes, So it's harder than it looks, but it's definitely something you can learn,
So it takes practice, and it takes reading a lot of magazine stories too to get used to that kind of thematic style.
Yes, it does. And I think that there are, masters of this form that you can read in things like the New Yorker, or here in Canada, the Walrus, and we have a lot of really good magazines, both online and print, where you'll see some wonderful examples. We're almost really in a heyday of this kind of writing, because we have apps like longform.org or longreads.com. You can get an app for your iPhone, and if you're sitting in a waiting room, you can click on the app and read a wonderful piece of magazine journalism, or what we call, creative nonfiction or literary nonfiction. So it's out there.
And on that topic, some say journalism is dying and magazines along with it. So how is the medium changing?
It's true that it's becoming harder to get paid for this kind of writing, and there are fewer print magazines for this kind of writing. But conversely, there are growing numbers of digital magazines that take this kind of writing. Even BuzzFeed has now got a long-form section on its website. So I think that maybe it's becoming more of a niche, and not everybody's going to be interested, or there's a time and a place for it. Sometimes we're so rushed, we really do just want those little short snippets. But there are other times when I think we want to relax and we want to really dig our teeth into a long, long story. So I think as long as that demand is there, there will always be venues for this kind of writing. But it's still something, I think you have to think of it as a labor of love almost. You have to do that story because you really want to tell it, and figure out how you're going to sell it after that. It is possible, but it's difficult.
So what are the ways that you can sell it? How can journalists adapt to kind of the freelance model of journalism?
Well, I think, again, if there is a story you want to tell and you are looking for a magazine that you might sell it to, you've got to read that magazine from beginning to end, probably a year's worth, I'd say, so that you really understand what that magazine is looking for and what kind of stories they run. And then you need to look at their writer's submission guidelines, because pretty well every magazine will have them, and they're all pretty specific and they differ. So you find the guidelines, you pitch the editor using the advice in those guidelines. And I would say for beginning writers, it's really a good idea to look at the shorter pieces that are that they're looking for, because they may not want to try a new writer with a great big long ambitious story to begin with, but they would love to get a good idea for one of their shorter sections. And if you come up with a good one and it's really, really tailored to the magazine, and if they see evidence in your pitch that you've read the magazine, you know what they're looking for, and you can write it, then you're in. It's just a matter of getting that foot in the door.
So basically start small and make sure that you know what you're talking about.
Absolutely. The other thing you can think about is the fact that there are a lot of writing competitions now. Journals will have long-form writing competitions. CBC has a annual competition. Quite a few magazines now will have competitions. So even if you don't even have to think about whether you're going to win or lose that competition, because probably there'll be a lot of other people entering, but it is practice for those skills.
So we talked a little bit about freelancing tips and how journalists can get their work out there. What are some ways that journalists can stand out? I mean, lots of people are submitting their articles, so how can you set yourself apart from those other submissions?
You know, I don't know if you can consciously do that. I think that you, first of all, as I said, to be professional and to, read those writer's guidelines and read the magazine, and believe it or not, you'll stand out because you've actually taken that trouble. And I have been a magazine editor, and I've received a lot of pitches from people who clearly didn't know the magazine, and there was just no hope that what they pitched was acceptable or appropriate. So if you've done that homework, you will stand out that way. But as far as developing a voice, I think there's still a bit of mystery in that. There's a craft part of this, and there's an art part of this. And I think that we all just have to try our best and see what comes out, and hope that you have an editor who says, actually, you've got a really good style, or is prepared to nurture that through. I don't think it's something you can necessarily consciously do. Some people just have that unique voice, and somebody discovers it and lets them run with it, and that's how it goes.
Sometimes you just have to be willing to take that chance and to put yourself out there.
I think so, and hope that, as I said, that you find an editor who gets you and who is prepared to help you develop that voice.
And because writing magazine stories can be very different from writing hard news stories, we've talked in previous episodes about how to find hard news story ideas, but how can you find good magazine ideas?
That is also a really interesting art, I think, or let's say you read the news today, and any story that you see on the front page, you can probably think about a human angle that isn't going to be covered in that hard news. So if it's a story of a government minister who is corrupt or something, maybe you look into the victims of whatever corruption he or she has been guilty of, and interview them and talk about their lives. I mean, that might be one thing. You might also, I've always been interested in nature and the environment, and I've done a lot of stories that way, so I will see something, a little news story about a nearly extinct bird, and I want to meet the people who are trying to preserve that, and once you've sort of thought, okay, well, that to me is very interesting, then you have to go and look through databases and see if that story has been written. That's another mistake I would say sometimes people make, is not doing that research. You need to know what else is out there on this subject. And if you find that there is something similar, maybe you can tailor your story idea accordingly, or maybe you find, gee, there hasn't been anything written on this, so I know I'm onto something. And then you find the magazine and, tailor it to them. So I guess it's kind of a process, and I don't know that every writer works the same way. I think for me, coming up with ideas has always been, they come to you not randomly, but you get a feel for what is going to be a good story idea as a freelancer, I think. And you just hope that you find an editor that agrees with you.
It sounds like these magazine stories are kind of the stories behind the stories. What are the people that we aren't talking about? What do they have to say?
Yes, I think that is true. And then the style of writing it is going to be, accordingly, you want to paint a portrait of that person. So you want to describe what they look like, and you want to make a scene of when you actually go and interview them. So it's not just he said, she said this, he said that. It's we sat in this person's office, and you're looking for those little telltale details about that indicate their character, for instance. So you have to sort of take notes on what is going on around them, as well as what they're saying to you. So you develop the ability to really scan a room and make notes about what's in it. And, I saw a documentary once about a woman in Quebec who was running a sanctuary for retired chimpanzees from research labs. And I found it absolutely fascinating and quite heartbreaking that these animals had been really tortured in these situations. And because it was in Canada, it was an American documentary, but she was in Canada. And I thought, maybe nobody has written about that. So I went looking. I did find one article in an American magazine, but nothing in Canada. So I pitched it. A couple of magazines rejected it. But then Chatelaine magazine, women's magazine, bought it, but they wanted it to be a profile of this woman and, what motivates her to do this kind of work. So that's an angle. That's a different angle than it might be for a general interest publication. And so I went to the sanctuary and, met all these chimpanzees and met her and met the volunteers and wrote this story about the sanctuary. But the larger story was really about, how we treat lab animals. Some of them were not even just lab animals, but from circuses and pets and things like that. So it was getting at a larger issue through, one person's story.
And what you were saying before was how Chatelaine kind of gave you an angle. And that kind of speaks to how, depending on where you pitch your story, the publication might affect how you write it.
Exactly, yes. And that is an exercise I give my students too, is take a story idea and shape it for a business magazine, a women's magazine, a health magazine, and think about how all these different magazines might ask you to take the same basic idea, but just tweak it a little so that it fits their mandate.
And we talked a little bit about some examples that you can read to learn about fantastic magazine writing, but can we talk a little bit more just before we finish up about great examples of magazine journalism?
Well, I use a great textbook called Storycraft, and it's by a former journalist and written for journalists, Jack Hart, and he's really great at going through the elements of a magazine article and talking about the structure. There's also a Canadian book called The Bigger Picture, Elements of Feature Writing, and that includes articles from a variety of magazine writers talking about a specific aspect of magazine writing. That's a great one. But in terms of the writers today that would be fantastic to look at, Sarah Stillman writes a lot for The New Yorker, and she writes just superb long-form articles. Now, she has the luxury of spending, a year doing research, but nevertheless, she's a great example of what you can do with this form. In Canada, we have a lot of really talented writers writing for things like The Walrus or for Maisonneuve magazine and a few online publications. I just think there's no shortage, or as I said, just get yourself the app for long form or for long reads and just scroll through, because there's just endless examples of great writing.
Thank you for listening to the Educate a Girl podcast series. To learn more about Educate a Girl, visit our Facebook page.